The world remembers Queen Victoria as one of the most famous monarchs in history, a woman whose name defined an entire era, whose portraits hang in museums, whose image still feels as immovable as the granite statues raised in her honor. Her reign stretched across decades, continents, and events so monumental they seem carved into the very bedrock of history. But history, for all its grandeur, is also selective. It chooses its heroes, fixes its gaze on the most visible figures, and lets others fade quietly into the background. And in the shadows of Victoria's imposing legacy stands a daughter whose story is stranger, more vivid, and far more rebellious than most people realize. This is not the tale of a passive royal living in her mother's long shadow. This is the story of Princess Louise, the sixth child of Queen Victoria, an artist, reformer, and boundary breaker who refused to be defined solely by her title. In an age when princesses were expected to be silent symbols of grace and obedience, Louise picked up a chisel and hammer, carving marble sculptures with her own hands. She mingled with radical thinkers, supported causes her mother found controversial, and crossed oceans to connect with communities far beyond the marble corridors of Buckingham Palace. She was, in every sense, a royal revolutionary, and yet her name has all but slipped from the public memory. Why does history forget people like her? Perhaps because her contributions didn't fit the dramatic mold of power struggles and political intrigue. She didn't seize a throne or wage a war. Instead, she shaped culture through art, expanded opportunities for women, and quietly altered the perception of what royalty could be. But her life was no less extraordinary for it. In fact, it's precisely this quiet defiance, this willingness to live by her own convictions, that makes her story so compelling today. Imagine being the daughter of one of the most scrutinized women in the world and choosing to step beyond the carefully guarded boundaries of palace life. Imagine traveling to Canada as the wife of the Governor-General, not just as a figurehead, but as someone eager to engage with the people, to understand their world, to leave a tangible mark that would last long after her return to Britain. Louise's story is filled with such moments, ones that reveal her as both a product of the Victorian age and a subtle challenger to it. And yet, despite all this, she remains a faint figure in the collective memory, overshadowed by the enormity of her mother's fame. It's time to change that. It's time to walk into the shadow of the legend, not to diminish Victoria's light, but to reveal the overlooked brilliance of a daughter whose life deserves to be remembered in full color. Welcome to Words of Time. In this video, we're uncovering the untold story of Princess Louise, an unconventional royal who defied expectations, embraced art and reform, and left behind a legacy that history nearly erased. It is often said that Queen Victoria's reign is one of the most documented, discussed, and mythologized periods in modern history. From portraits and statues to literature and the now familiar term Victorian, that has become shorthand for an entire age's values, technology, art, and politics, her presence looms large. She has been cast in the collective imagination as the sovereign who gave her name to an era of industrial revolution, expanding empire, and rigid morality. Her life has been told in countless biographies, adapted in films and television, and analyzed in works of history that examine not just her personality, but also her symbolic role in Britain's imperial identity. She is remembered as both a figure of extraordinary influence and a woman whose personal story, her marriage to Prince Albert, her long widowhood, her political relationships with successive prime ministers, has been woven into the very fabric of the 19th century's narrative. It is easy to imagine that every corner of her life has been scrutinized, every person close to her identified, and given their place in the public record. Yet history, even when well-trodden, has its shadows. It is in these shadows that the subject of our exploration resides. For all the attention lavished upon Queen Victoria herself, there are figures in her immediate family whose names are rarely, if ever, spoken outside specialist circles. One might assume that the children of such a renowned monarch, especially a monarch whose reign spanned more than 6 decades, would all be household names, remembered for their roles in the political and cultural landscapes of their time. And indeed, several of Victoria's children do appear regularly in historical accounts. The eldest, Victoria, Princess Royal, who became German Empress; the second son, Edward, who ascended the throne as King Edward VII; Princess Alice, remembered for her charitable works and her tragic death; Alfred, Duke of Edinburgh and later Duke of Saxe-Coburg and Gotha, and so on. Their stories are relatively well preserved, their lives folded into the larger tapestry of royal history. But there is at least one daughter whose presence in that tapestry is so faint that it is barely visible, and in some accounts, entirely absent. This absence is not merely a matter of neglect in the popular imagination. It is symptomatic of a deeper dynamic in historical storytelling. The official narrative of the Victorian monarchy, like so many official narratives, tends to foreground the individuals whose actions intersected with major political events, foreign policy, or dynastic strategy. Those whose lives unfolded in less conspicuous ways are often relegated to footnotes, even when their personal significance to the principal figures was substantial. In the case of this daughter, the fact that she lived in the penumbra of a mother whose public image was so dominating may have contributed to her obscurity. When the protagonist of a historical era is so vast in scale, those standing beside her, unless they too engage in dramatic public acts, are easily overshadowed. It is worth pausing to ask why this omission matters. If this daughter's life was not one of great political consequence, one might argue that the historical silence surrounding her is simply a reflection of her limited public role. But history is not merely the record of the powerful. It is also the record of the lived experiences that surround power. To overlook a child of Queen Victoria is to overlook a fragment of the human context in which the Victorian monarchy functioned. The relationships within the royal family, the private bonds and conflicts, the personal tragedies and triumphs. These are as vital to understanding the reign as the official policies and public ceremonies. A forgotten daughter is a gap in the emotional geography of the Victorian court. Moreover, the selective remembering and forgetting of historical figures tells us something about the mechanisms of memory itself. The tendency to spotlight certain individuals while allowing others to fade is not random. It is shaped by the narratives that later generations find most useful, dramatic, or flattering. Queen Victoria's reign has been mythologized as a period of stability and moral rectitude, personified in her own formidable persona. A daughter whose life story did not fit neatly into that myth. Perhaps because it lacked political utility, perhaps because it was tinged with discomfort, would have been quietly excluded from the grand retelling. In this sense, her obscurity is not just an accident of history, but a product of deliberate or unconscious editorial choices. One might also consider the role of gender in this selective memory. In a patriarchal society, even one nominally ruled by a queen, daughters who did not marry advantageously, influence international relations, or engage in conspicuous charitable work were unlikely to receive enduring public attention. Sons could inherit titles, lands, and political power. Their actions, even if modest, often entered the historical record by virtue of their institutional roles. Daughters, by contrast, were often remembered, if at all, for the men they married or the ceremonial duties they performed. If this particular daughter's life did not align with those traditional avenues for visibility, her erasure becomes more understandable in the context of Victorian values, though no less regrettable. It is telling that in popular accounts of Queen Victoria's family, the focus often falls on those children whose destinies intersected with continental politics. The Princess Royal's marriage to the future German emperor, Princess Alice's links to the Hessian court and eventual connection to the Russian imperial family through her daughter, King Edward VI's diplomatic and social influence. All of these threads connect the British monarchy to the great political dramas of Europe. A daughter who did not participate in such high-profile alliances would have offered less fodder for the grand narrative of monarchy as a linchpin of international diplomacy. Her life, no matter how rich in personal significance, would have seemed peripheral to the storytellers of the age. The question then becomes, how could such a daughter be so easily forgotten, even by those who have pored over the intricate details of Queen Victoria's reign? Part of the answer lies in the way history is consumed. Popular history often seeks coherence, a central storyline, and a manageable cast of characters. Too many figures without obvious influence can make the narrative feel cluttered. Thus, editors and authors may consciously limit the number of secondary characters they present, even if this results in the erasure of individuals who were, in their own time, quite real and present. In the case of Victoria's children, the ones whose lives intersected with major events become recurring characters. Those whose stories are quieter are omitted. Another part of the answer has to do with the sources themselves. Much of what we know about Queen Victoria's family comes from letters, diaries, official documents, and contemporary press coverage. These sources are not neutral. The Queen herself was known to be careful about her public image and the image of her family. She destroyed or suppressed documents that she considered unflattering, and she had a keen sense of how posterity might judge her and her kin. If she felt that a daughter's life was private, unremarkable, or best left undescribed, the historical record would reflect that decision. In a sense, the Queen's control over her family's portrayal has extended far beyond her lifetime, shaping not only the content of what was remembered, but the very boundaries of what could be known. It is also possible that the daughter's own personality and choices played a role in her obscurity. Some people are inclined to seek the limelight, to leave traces of themselves in the form of public works, art, or political action. Others live more privately, valuing personal contentment over public recognition. A daughter who preferred a quiet life away from the court's formalities, who did not marry into a prominent position, and who left few written records would, inevitably, be less visible to future historians. Yet her lack of public ambition does not mean her life lacked interest, complexity, or significance. It merely means that the tools historians rely on to reconstruct the past offer fewer glimpses into her world. In thinking about this forgotten daughter, one is reminded that historical memory is not a perfect mirror of the past, but a selective, refracted image shaped by countless choices. Some made by the subjects themselves, some by those who recorded their lives, and some by later generations interpreting the evidence. The fact that she remains in the shadows while her mother is remembered in near-legendary terms is emblematic of how uneven the light of history can be. It illuminates some faces brightly, while leaving others, equally close, in deep shade. If we were to bring her back into focus, even hypothetically, we might imagine the contours of a life shaped by the contradictions of the Victorian court. A mother who was both an affectionate parent and a controlling matriarch. Siblings whose lives took them to distant courts. A society in which a royal daughter's choices were at once constrained and scrutinized, and a personal identity formed in the overwhelming shadow of a monarch whose fame was global. We might see in her life an alternative lens on the Victorian age, one that is more intimate, more domestic, and perhaps more revealing in its very ordinariness. Her story, though lacking the grandeur of diplomacy or the drama of political upheaval, could offer a rare view into the everyday realities of royal existence, stripped of the ceremonial spectacle. It is precisely because she was forgotten that her story, if recovered, would carry such weight. It would remind us that behind the towering legends of history stand countless individuals whose experiences are no less real for being overlooked. It would challenge the notion that only the most public, consequential lives deserve remembrance. And it would invite us to reconsider the boundaries of historical significance, expanding them to include the quiet, the marginal, and the nearly invisible. In this way, the shadow of a legend becomes not just a metaphor for obscurity, but a call to turn our attention toward the spaces where history's light has failed to reach. Princess Louise, the sixth child of Queen Victoria and Prince Albert, emerges from the historical record as a figure both intriguing and elusive, a woman who resisted being neatly folded into the rigid template that 19th-century society had prepared for her. In the context of the Victorian royal household, where duty, decorum, and tradition were the governing forces, Louise's character and choices stood out sharply. She was born into a family that, by its very nature, existed in a world of ceremony and spectacle, where every gesture could be scrutinized by both the court and the public. Yet from her earliest years, she displayed a restlessness toward that ceremonial role, an impulse to shape her identity on her own terms rather than merely inhabit the one assigned to her. Her upbringing, while undeniably privileged, was marked by a paradoxical blend of strict discipline and intellectual stimulation. Queen Victoria and Prince Albert believed strongly in the moral and physical education of their children, often emphasizing rigorous studies, moral rectitude, and a sense of personal duty. Lessons were formal, and the Queen was not above expressing dissatisfaction if a child failed to meet her expectations. At the same time, Prince Albert encouraged the arts, sciences, and exposure to progressive ideas, which meant that within the confines of a highly regulated environment, sparks of individuality could still take root. Louise absorbed this duality, on the one hand trained to fulfill the ceremonial role of a princess, on the other inspired to cultivate her own creative voice. From an early age, her interests revealed an unconventional streak. While many of her sisters gravitated toward charitable works and the genteel pastimes considered appropriate for young women of their station, Louise found herself drawn to the visual arts. She was not content to dabble in them merely as a hobby. She pursued them with a seriousness that hinted at ambition. Sculpture, in particular, fascinated her, and she demonstrated both aptitude and determination in mastering its demanding techniques. In an era when female artists were often dismissed as amateurs, and when the idea of a royal daughter engaging in physically strenuous work like carving stone was faintly scandalous, her dedication to the craft was quietly radical. Louise's progressive inclinations were not confined to her art. She was notably receptive to the social and political discussions of her time, sometimes aligning herself with viewpoints that diverged from the prevailing conservatism of her mother's court. The mid to late 19th century was a period of shifting debates around women's education, property rights, and public roles, and while Louise could not openly advocate for sweeping reforms without courting controversy, she was known to voice support for expanding women's opportunities. This perspective, though cautious by modern standards, marked her as something of an anomaly among her siblings, many of whom remained closely aligned with the more traditionalist stances of their upbringing. For a Victorian princess, societal expectations were both explicit and constraining. Marriage was often the central event of a royal daughter's life, arranged with careful consideration for political advantage and dynastic alliance. A princess was expected to embody the ideals of femininity prized by the age: modesty, deference, graciousness, and a devotion to family and charitable causes. Her education, while comprehensive, was generally intended to prepare her for a supporting role in the life of a prominent man, be he a prince, duke, or foreign noble. She was not expected to cultivate a career, nor to pursue ambitions that might compete with or overshadow her husband's. Louise, however, often resisted the quiet acquiescence such a role demanded. This resistance was not always overt. She was too aware of her position and the consequences of open defiance. Yet her choices revealed a careful but deliberate assertion of individuality. Her decision to train formally as an artist, to mix socially with people outside the aristocracy, and to express sympathy for causes not universally embraced within her family. All of these signaled a woman negotiating the boundaries of her prescribed role. Her personality was by many accounts vivacious and spirited, traits that sometimes put her at odds with her mother's more severe and controlling nature. Queen Victoria, while affectionate in her way, often preferred her children to be compliant extensions of her will. Louise's outspokenness and independent habits occasionally provoked friction, but they also earned her admiration from those who valued her refusal to be entirely subsumed by the weight of royal protocol. She cultivated friendships with artists, intellectuals, and reform-minded figures, weaving herself into networks that were far removed from the usual circles of royalty. This was not rebellion for its own sake, but rather a deliberate enrichment of her own world, an expansion of experience that allowed her to see beyond the gilded confines of her birth. Even her marriage reflected this tension between tradition and independence. When Louise married John Campbell, Marquess of Lorne, later the ninth Duke of Argyll, it was notable for being a match within the British aristocracy rather than a foreign royal alliance, breaking a pattern that had long been the norm for Victoria's daughters. The union was politically acceptable, but it also offered Louise a measure of autonomy in remaining within Britain, closer to her artistic circles and personal interests. While the marriage itself was not without its difficulties, it reflected her willingness to depart from precedent in ways that served her own priorities. Her life as a princess was thus a balancing act between the public role she could not escape and the private self she strove to cultivate. In many ways, Louise embodied the contradictions of her age. A woman shaped by Victorian ideals yet drawn to ideas and activities that challenged them. A royal daughter bound by duty, yet determined to carve out a life that was authentically her own. She inhabited a world where even small acts of independence could carry outsized meaning, and she embraced those acts whenever she could. Her legacy, though often overshadowed by the more conventional paths of her siblings, reveals a figure who quietly tested the limits of what it meant to be a princess in the age of Victoria. Louise's growing involvement in social causes was not an accidental drift into fashionable philanthropy, but a conscious alignment of her values with the movements stirring in Britain during the later decades of the 19th century. She lived in a period when the first significant cracks were appearing in the rigid framework of Victorian gender roles. The question of women's rights, particularly in education, property ownership, and professional participation, was beginning to trouble the comfortable assumptions of the ruling classes. For most women of her rank, such matters were discussed at a polite remove, acknowledged but rarely acted upon in any sustained way. Louise, however, moved closer to the heart of these debates, not as a formal political agitator. Her position would not have permitted open activism, but as an influential supporter lending quiet legitimacy to ideas that were, in her time, still viewed with suspicion by many in power. Her belief in the importance of education reform was perhaps the most consistent thread in her public engagement. She took a keen interest in expanding access to learning for women, a cause that intersected with her own life as someone who had pursued a form of professional training unusual for a princess. She understood that education was the foundation upon which women could build independence and self-sufficiency, and she gave her patronage to schools and institutions that worked toward these aims. Her involvement was not limited to ceremonial openings or donations. She engaged in discussions with reformers, took an interest in curriculum, and supported the establishment of programs that prepared women for careers, including in the arts. In doing so, she used her royal name not merely to endorse, but to normalize the notion that women's minds were as deserving of cultivation as men's. Her perspective on women's rights was shaped in part by the people she encountered beyond the walls of the palace. Artists, intellectuals, and reformers formed part of her social circle, and these relationships exposed her to a variety of viewpoints far broader than those found in the usual royal milieu. The result was a sympathy for the struggles of women outside the aristocracy and a recognition of the barriers they faced. Although she could not, by virtue of her position, take to public platforms with radical rhetoric, her private conversations and personal support for certain initiatives served as quiet acts of advocacy. In a world where the monarchy was both a symbol of continuity and a potential influence on public opinion, such acts were not insignificant. If her social causes marked her as a princess with progressive leanings, it was her career as a sculptor that most vividly displayed her departure from convention. Sculpture was not a genteel pastime. It was a demanding discipline that required physical strength, technical skill, and an unflinching commitment to the medium. For a woman, especially a royal woman, to engage in it seriously was nearly unheard of. Yet Louise was not content to be an amateur producing works for private amusement. She sought instruction from respected teachers, enrolled at institutions such as the National Art Training School, and undertook commissions that placed her work in the public eye. This was not the role of a dabbler. It was the work of someone determined to master her craft. Her most notable public commissions stand as tangible proof of her abilities. Among them was the statue of Queen Victoria situated outside Kensington Palace, completed in the early 1900s, a work that combined personal significance with public purpose. This was not merely a daughter's tribute to her mother. It was also a statement of her own competence, executed on a scale that demanded both artistic vision and technical command. The figure of the Queen, rendered with dignity and grace, reflected Louise's understanding of how art could shape memory and perception. It also demonstrated her willingness to step into a traditionally male-dominated field and prove herself capable of work that would endure in the public realm. Another important project was her memorial to Colonel Sir George Airy, the Astronomer Royal, which showed her versatility in handling portraiture in 3 dimensions. Such works required an acute eye for character as well as form, and they reveal her ability to capture more than physical likeness. They suggest that for Louise, sculpture was not simply about reproducing appearances, but about conveying essence, a challenge she approached with the same seriousness that marked her other endeavors. Her career also brought her into contact with the broader artistic community of Britain, including members of the Royal Academy and the Art Workers Guild. While the Academy itself remained resistant to fully integrating women, Louise's position allowed her to move among its members and to support exhibitions and institutions that offered opportunities to female artists. She did so without ostentation, aware that her royal status was both a privilege and a potential point of criticism. By maintaining high standards for her own work, she ensured that her artistic identity was grounded in merit as well as title. Louise's commitment to sculpture and her social causes reflected a shared philosophy: the belief that individuals, regardless of gender, should be free to develop their talents and contribute to society in meaningful ways. This was, in the context of her time, a quietly revolutionary stance. It did not involve the overthrow of institutions or the rejection of monarchy. Rather, it sought to expand the possibilities within the existing framework. She used her influence to create openings, small perhaps, but real, for others to follow. In her art, she challenged assumptions about what a woman, and particularly a princess, could do. In her advocacy, she supported changes that would make such challenges less exceptional for the generations to come. The balancing act she performed was delicate. She had to navigate a court in which her mother's approval was still a powerful force. The press's appetite for royal gossip was insatiable, and public opinion could turn quickly against those seen as stepping too far beyond their prescribed roles. That she managed to pursue her work and her causes without igniting scandal speaks to her political acumen as much as to her personal courage. She understood the value of discretion, of allowing her actions to speak in measured tones rather than loud proclamations. This subtlety may be one reason her contributions have not always received the recognition they deserve, but it was also the reason she was able to make them at all. Louise's life, when seen through the lens of her social activism and her art, challenges the stereotype of the Victorian princess as a passive figurehead. She was neither a radical in the streets nor a recluse in the palace. She was a working artist and a woman engaged with the intellectual currents of her time, using the avenues available to her to promote ideas she believed in. That her name is not always associated with these achievements is perhaps due to the same forces that obscured the lives of other royal women whose contributions fell outside the grand narratives of statecraft and diplomacy. Yet her story, once told, complicates and enriches our understanding of what it meant to live within the shadow of Queen Victoria and still carve, both literally and figuratively, a space of one's own. When Louise accompanied her husband, the Marquis of Lorne, to Canada after his appointment as Governor-General in the late 1870s, it was more than a dutiful relocation for the sake of imperial service. It was a step into an unfamiliar world that would challenge and expand her role as a member of the British royal family. For a Victorian princess accustomed to the established hierarchies and formalities of London and court life, the move to a dominion still forging its national identity represented both a break from tradition and a unique opportunity. It was the first time a member of the British royal family had taken up residence in Canada for an extended period, and the novelty of her presence, combined with her personality and interests, ensured that her tenure there would leave a distinct impression. The couple's arrival in Canada was greeted with a mixture of enthusiasm and curiosity. Canadians of the time were deeply conscious of their connection to the British Crown, yet their society was shaped by a blend of British, French, Indigenous, and immigrant influences that made it far less rigid than the aristocratic circles of Britain. Louise's openness to these differences became one of her defining traits during her stay. She approached her new environment with a willingness to engage beyond the ceremonial duties that typically occupied a vice-regal consort. Although protocol still shaped her public appearances, she did not confine herself to receptions and formal dinners. She sought opportunities to connect with artists, educators, and reform-minded individuals, mirroring the circles she had cultivated in Britain. Her artistic inclinations found fertile ground in Canada's growing cultural scene. While the arts were still developing institutional strength in the Dominion, Louise recognized their potential to foster a shared sense of identity in a young and geographically vast nation. She lent her patronage to exhibitions and supported artists whose work reflected the Canadian landscape and way of life. Her presence added prestige to artistic societies and encouraged broader public interest in cultural development. She even established personal friendships with local artists, often discussing technique and vision with a seriousness that surprised those unaccustomed to a royal figure treating art as more than a polite amusement. Her time in Canada thus became an extension of her belief that art could shape the character of a society, and she applied the same philosophy that had guided her own sculptural work to her support of others. Louise's influence, however, extended well beyond the arts. She also championed causes related to education and health, continuing the interests she had cultivated in Britain but adapting them to Canadian circumstances. She took an active interest in the conditions of schools, particularly those serving girls, and was vocal in her support for expanding educational opportunities. In an environment where access to schooling could be limited by geography, language, and economic circumstances, her advocacy carried symbolic weight. It reinforced the idea that education was central to the progress of the Dominion and worthy of investment. Her involvement in these matters, while often channeled through the expected charitable structures of the time, was nonetheless rooted in a genuine belief in reform rather than mere ceremonial obligation. The couple's travels throughout Canada provided Louise with a broader view of the challenges and possibilities facing the country. Journeys that might have been purely symbolic for another vice-regal pair became occasions for her to engage directly with communities. She visited remote settlements, conversed with settlers and local leaders, and observed firsthand the diversity of the population. These encounters deepened her understanding of the cultural and political dynamics at play in a country still balancing its British colonial heritage with its emerging identity. She was particularly struck by the vastness of the land and the resilience of those who inhabited it, qualities she admired and spoke of warmly in her correspondence. Louise's time in Canada also revealed a more personal independence than she had sometimes been allowed in Britain. The relative informality of life in Ottawa, compared to London, provided space for her to shape her own schedule and pursuits. Though she remained mindful of her position and the expectations attached to it, she was less constrained by the suffocating scrutiny of the British court. This freedom allowed her to cultivate a public image that was approachable and engaged, rather than distant and ceremonial. She was seen walking, skating, and riding in public places with a degree of informality that endeared her to many Canadians. Such moments were not orchestrated displays, but genuine expressions of her enjoyment in exploring her surroundings and meeting people outside formal settings. Her willingness to immerse herself in Canadian life helped soften some of the tensions that could arise between colonial administration and local populations. The Marquess of Lorne's governorship was not without political challenges, but Louise's popularity often acted as a counterbalance. She was able to bridge gaps in understanding simply by being present and interested, offering a human dimension to the sometimes abstract authority of imperial governance. In this way, she played a quiet but meaningful role in fostering goodwill between the Crown and its subjects in Canada. Yet her time in Canada was not without hardship. The physical demands of travel in the late 19th century, especially in winter conditions, were considerable. Louise suffered a serious accident during a sleigh ride in Ottawa, an event that not only injured her physically but also underscored the unpredictability of life in a climate and terrain so different from that of England. Her resilience in recovering from the incident, and her return to public engagements thereafter, further cemented her reputation for determination. Canadians saw in her not just a royal visitor, but a woman who faced the same dangers and discomforts they did, and who met them with composure. The symbolic significance of her Canadian sojourn extended beyond her personal experiences. By living in the Dominion, Louise helped to strengthen the sense of connection between Canada and the British monarchy in a way that was more immediate than distant ceremonial ties could achieve. Her presence lent a degree of intimacy to the imperial relationship, making it possible for Canadians to see the monarchy as something more than an abstract institution in London. This personal connection would resonate for years, influencing how the Crown was perceived in Canada and setting a precedent for later royal visits. Louise's departure from Canada, after her husband's term ended, did not erase her impact. Institutions and communities remembered her support, and her name was preserved in Canadian geography, most notably in the naming of Lake Louise in the Rocky Mountains. The beauty of that lake, framed by dramatic peaks, has since become one of Canada's most iconic landscapes, and the association with Louise serves as a reminder of her time there. While such naming might seem a simple gesture, it reflects the esteem in which she was held and the impression she made during her years in the country. In reflecting on her Canadian experience, it becomes clear that Louise approached the role of vice-regal consort not as a static title, but as an active opportunity. She applied the same principles that guided her in Britain, artistic encouragement, educational advocacy, social engagement, to a setting that was both more fluid and more demanding in its variety. She did so without relinquishing her own identity as an artist and a progressive thinker, weaving those elements into her public life in a way that expanded the possibilities for what a princess could be in the context of imperial service. Her years in Canada thus form a vital chapter in her life, illustrating her adaptability, her willingness to embrace new challenges, and her capacity to influence a society far removed from the palace corridors of her youth. She brought to Canada not just the aura of royalty, but the substance of a woman who believed in the transformative power of culture, education, and personal connection. In doing so, she left behind a legacy that was both distinctly her own and deeply intertwined with the history of the country that hosted her. Louise's return from Canada might have been expected to cement her place in public memory. After all, she had been the first royal to live in the Dominion for an extended period, had influenced its cultural and educational institutions, and had left her name quite literally imprinted on the map. Yet, as the years passed, the glow of her Canadian chapter dimmed in the wider historical narrative, and the woman who had once been seen as an innovator within the royal family began to fade from popular consciousness. This was not the result of a single event, but rather a convergence of circumstances that quietly nudged her into the margins of history. One of the most immediate factors was the nature of her personal life after Canada. Unlike her siblings whose fates carried them into dynastic dramas, marriages that altered political alliances, early deaths that became public tragedies, or reigns that reshaped the monarchy, Louise's later years were comparatively subdued. Her marriage to the Duke of Argyll, though groundbreaking in its choice of a British aristocrat over a foreign royal, was not one that generated the kind of enduring legend that attaches itself to royal unions of high political stakes. Their relationship, though long-lasting, did not produce children, and thus there were no direct heirs to carry forward her personal story within the public arena. The absence of dramatic twists or generational continuities left fewer hooks upon which collective memory might hang. In addition, Louise's own temperament contributed to the gradual erosion of her public profile. She had never been one to seek attention for its own sake. Even in her most active years, advocating for women's education, working as a sculptor, supporting the arts, she often preferred quiet action to public proclamation. This discretion, while allowing her to navigate the constraints of royal life without scandal, also meant that she left behind fewer headline-grabbing episodes. Her legacy was built on sustained, incremental contributions rather than singular, dramatic gestures. Such contributions, though vital in the moment, are often more vulnerable to historical neglect when later narratives privilege spectacle over substance. The shadow of her mother loomed particularly large in the shaping of her posthumous reputation. Queen Victoria's reign was not only long but also thoroughly chronicled, with the monarch's own writings, official records, and the work of court chroniclers ensuring her dominance in the historical record. Victoria's personality, commanding, complex, and often at the center of both public and private drama, naturally drew the focus of biographers and historians. Her children, while individually significant, were frequently depicted in relation to her, their own stories folded into the greater narrative of the Queen's reign. For Louise, this meant that her distinct achievements were often subsumed into passing references in biographies of her mother, where they served as illustrative episodes rather than as the foundation of a standalone account. The historiographical habits of the late 19th and early 20th centuries also played a role. The period's chroniclers, steeped in an understanding of history as the record of political events, wars, and statecraft, were less inclined to dwell on the cultural or social contributions of individuals who did not hold direct political power. A princess who was an artist, a patron of education, and a quietly progressive thinker was unlikely to command the same space in the historical record as a monarch, a prime minister, or a military leader. As a result, the richness of her work in sculpture, her support for Canadian arts, and her influence on women's education were often relegated to minor footnotes. Moreover, the changing nature of the monarchy in the 20th century subtly recast how past royals were remembered. After the upheavals of 2 world wars, the institution sought to emphasize its stability, continuity, and public service. Figures from the Victorian era, who could be presented as paragons of duty or as central to major historical shifts, were readily incorporated into this narrative. Louise's life, which blended tradition with measured defiance, did not fit neatly into the new mythmaking. She was neither the unbending symbol of the old monarchy nor the modernizer who heralded a new age. Instead, she was a figure of nuance, progressive but cautious, independent yet loyal to the crown, qualities that, while admirable, were less easily distilled into the simplified imagery often used to sustain public memory. Her own careful management of her privacy further complicated her historical visibility. Louise destroyed much of her personal correspondence and certain records of her work, a choice perhaps motivated by the desire to protect both her own reputation and that of her family. While such actions ensured discretion in her lifetime, they also deprived future historians of the raw material needed to construct a detailed account of her inner life. Without letters to reveal her thoughts, diaries to map her daily activities, or detailed accounts of her creative process, much of her personality and perspective was left to be inferred from scattered mentions in others' writings. The result was a fragmented image, easily overshadowed by the more vividly documented figures around her. The rise of popular media in the early 20th century further tilted the balance toward those members of the royal family whose lives offered clear narratives for public consumption. Photographs, newsreels, and illustrated magazines created a new kind of celebrity monarchy, one in which image and spectacle became as important as ceremonial function. By the time this media landscape took shape, Louise was an aging duchess living largely out of the public eye. She did not benefit from the renewed fascination with royal lives that greeted younger, more publicly active figures. The glamorous imagery that might have reintroduced her to new generations was never cultivated, leaving her image fixed in the sepia tones of an earlier age. There was also the matter of shifting public interest. As Britain's empire contracted and its society modernized, the focus of historical attention moved toward figures and movements associated with these transformations. The Victorian era, while still of interest to scholars, was increasingly portrayed in popular culture through a handful of emblematic figures. Queen Victoria herself, Prince Albert as the industrious consort, and later Edward VII as the bridge to the modern monarchy. Within this framing, the roles of the Queen's daughters became secondary, often distilled to a sentence or two summarizing their marriages and general reputations. Without a singular defining event to her name, Louise's narrative was particularly susceptible to such compression. Her relative obscurity, however, should not be mistaken for insignificance. If anything, it speaks to the limitations of how history has often been told, favoring dramatic moments and towering personalities over the quieter, steadier influences that shape societies from within. Louise's work in advancing the arts, her advocacy for women's education, and her ability to navigate the rigid expectations of her position without losing her individuality represent a form of influence that operates subtly, often leaving no dramatic rupture in the historical timeline, but nonetheless altering the texture of the age. The fact that her contributions are harder to chart does not make them less real. It simply means they require more attentive excavation. In some ways, her fading from the popular record mirrors the experiences of many women of her era whose achievements fell outside the spheres most valued by contemporary historians. The spaces she occupied, studios, art schools, salons, educational committees, were significant arenas of cultural production and social change, yet they were peripheral to the formal centers of power. That these contributions were overshadowed by the more visible machinations of politics reflects the biases of the recorders as much as the realities of the past. The overwhelming presence of Queen Victoria in historical memory ensured that her children's identities would often be refracted through the prism of their relationship to her. For Louise, whose independence and unconventional pursuits might have threatened the neat image of a dutiful royal daughter, this meant that the complexities of her life were often softened or omitted in service of a more consistent narrative about the Queen's family. The result is that her legacy today exists in fragments. A statue here, a place named there, scattered references in art histories and accounts of Victorian society. To piece these fragments together is to recover not only the story of an individual, but also a more nuanced understanding of the era she inhabited. Louise's obscurity is therefore both a personal and a cultural phenomenon. It reflects the challenges of carving out a distinct identity in the shadow of one of Britain's most dominant monarchs, the limitations of the historical frameworks that shaped how lives were recorded, and her own choices about privacy and self-presentation. Yet it also offers a case study in how influence can persist beneath the surface, how a life lived with integrity and quiet determination can ripple outward in ways that may not be immediately visible to later generations. The very act of revisiting her life challenges the narrowing tendencies of historical memory and invites a broader definition of significance, one that makes room for the steady, shaping forces alongside the spectacular and the sensational. The way Louise's life has been remembered, or more accurately, underremembered, cannot be fully understood without examining the larger mechanics of how royal histories are written, curated, and passed down. Historical narratives, particularly those that emerge from royal contexts, are not neutral catalogs of events and personalities. They are shaped by a complex interplay of politics, public taste, archival accessibility, and in many cases, the self-conscious image-making of the royal family itself. Within this framework, certain types of royal stories are naturally elevated, while others recede into the background. It is not necessarily a question of deliberate suppression, though that can play a part. It is also a matter of how human memory and institutional record-keeping gravitate towards certain qualities: drama, political consequence and symbolic resonance over quieter forms of influence. In the public imagination, royals who directly influence the course of political events tend to dominate the historical record. Monarchs, heirs apparent, and consorts whose lives intersect with major wars, diplomatic crises, or sweeping reforms are almost always accorded a prominent place in the narrative. Their actions, by virtue of their official capacity, are documented in state papers, parliamentary debates, and the press, leaving a wealth of material for later historians to draw upon. Figures like Queen Victoria, whose reign encompassed profound transformations in Britain's economic, political, and imperial structures, will always command substantial historical space. In contrast, royals who exist a few steps removed from the line of succession, particularly those who do not marry into equally prominent foreign houses, are more likely to be remembered in supporting roles, if at all. Louise's life fell squarely into this second category. She was neither destined to inherit the throne nor to serve as a queen consort abroad. Her marriage to the Duke of Argyll was politically notable in its departure from the pattern of foreign dynastic matches, but it did not create a new political alliance or significantly shift the balance of power in Europe. Without such high political stakes, her public role was inherently more limited in the eyes of official chroniclers. Even her progressive views and her advocacy for women's education, though quietly influential, were peripheral to the dominant political narrative of the time. They were not seen as matters that would shape the trajectory of the monarchy or the empire in an immediate, headline-grabbing way. This prioritization of certain royal stories is reinforced by the way historical sources are preserved and classified. State archives naturally privilege political correspondence, treaties, and records of official engagements. Diaries and letters from monarchs and prime ministers are often meticulously preserved because of their perceived historical importance. By contrast, personal correspondence from royals without direct political authority may be scattered across private collections, sometimes withheld from public view by descendants or institutions. In Louise's case, her deliberate destruction of many personal papers left a gap that further reduced her visibility to historians. Without a rich documentary record, her story becomes harder to reconstruct in detail, and therefore less likely to be told in a sustained and comprehensive way. The challenge of preserving the legacy of a figure like Louise is compounded by the public's appetite for narratives that fit certain archetypes. The royal who sacrifices for love, the sovereign who steers a nation through crisis, the rebel who defies courtly convention. These are the stories that tend to endure. Louise's life contained elements of quiet rebellion and independence, but they were expressed through choices that did not lend themselves to grand, cinematic moments. She was not publicly disinherited for marrying beneath her station. She was not dramatically exiled for political dissent. She did not become a tragic figure whose untimely death could be romanticized. Instead, her resistance to convention was incremental, carefully balanced against her duties, and often conducted in ways that avoided direct confrontation with the monarchy's more conservative elements. While admirable, this mode of action does not easily translate into the simplified, emotionally charged narratives that tend to have the longest shelf life in public memory. Another factor influencing which royal stories are remembered lies in the economics of publishing and media. In the decades following Louise's death, biographies of Queen Victoria and her most prominent children continued to appear, driven by a readership interested in the great dramas of the Victorian era. Publishers and authors, responding to market demand, naturally focused on figures whose lives could be presented as central to the era's defining events. A book about Louise, lacking the same built-in dramatic milestones, would have been a harder sell, and thus fewer such works were attempted. Without sustained literary or scholarly attention, her image in the public consciousness faded further. It is worth noting that this is not unique to Louise. Across royal families in Europe, many individuals who played significant cultural or philanthropic roles have been eclipsed by siblings or cousins who occupied the throne or married into high-profile alliances. The history of the Habsburgs, for example, is filled with archdukes and archduchesses whose artistic or charitable contributions were substantial, yet who are barely mentioned in standard histories because they had no direct hand in political governance. Similarly, in the Russian imperial family, several grand duchesses who supported social reforms or pursued creative careers are known only to specialists, their legacies overshadowed by the tsars and tsarinas whose actions defined the fate of the empire. Louise's case thus reflects a broader pattern. The legacies of royals outside the immediate succession are inherently more fragile, relying heavily on deliberate preservation and advocacy to survive in public memory. The problem becomes even more pronounced when those figures actively resist being turned into symbols. Louise's destruction of personal records suggests a conscious decision to maintain control over how much of her private life could be scrutinized by later generations. This instinct for privacy, while understandable, deprived future historians of the intimate details that can humanize a subject and make them vivid to readers. In contrast, royals who left behind extensive diaries and correspondence, like her sister Princess Alice or her mother Queen Victoria, have been rendered in three-dimensional detail precisely because the raw materials of their inner lives are accessible. Without such material, Louise is left to be reconstructed largely from official engagements, second-hand accounts, and her surviving works of art, a thinner and less immediate portrait. This brings us to the question of legacy in its most practical sense. How does a figure whose achievements are not in the political realm ensure that their contributions are remembered? For an artist, the work itself can be a form of immortality, and in this respect, Louise's sculptures and public commissions serve as enduring markers of her skill and vision. Yet even here, the connection between the work and the artist can erode over time. Without active efforts to credit and contextualize her role, pieces like her statue of Queen Victoria at Kensington Palace risk being appreciated as anonymous works of public art rather than as the creation of a royal woman who defied convention to master a demanding craft. Similarly, her patronage of educational institutions in Canada and Britain may continue to bear fruit long after her death, but the association with her name can easily fade unless deliberately reinforced by institutional histories. The preservation of such legacies often depends on advocates, historians, curators, educators, who choose to bring these lesser-known stories into the light. In recent years, there has been a growing interest in recovering the narratives of women whose contributions were overlooked in traditional histories, and Louise stands to benefit from this broader cultural shift. Her life intersects with multiple areas of contemporary scholarly focus. The role of women in the arts, the intersections of gender and imperial service, and the negotiation of personal identity within rigid social structures. By situating her within these thematic frameworks, historians can reintroduce her to audiences who might otherwise never encounter her name. However, the recovery of such figures is always an uphill climb against the inertia of established narratives. Once a historical persona has been defined, whether as central or peripheral, it can be difficult to shift that perception in the public mind. For Louise, this means contending with the long-standing tendency to view her primarily as one of Queen Victoria's daughters, with all the limitations that descriptor carries. To redefine her legacy as that of an independent artist, a supporter of women's education, and a pioneering royal presence in Canada requires a deliberate reframing of the Victorian-era's story to make space for contributions that do not fit neatly into the categories of political or dynastic significance. There is also the matter of competing with the sheer scale of Queen Victoria's presence in the historical record. The Queen's longevity, the drama of her widowhood, and the symbolic weight of her name attached to an entire era make her an almost immovable centerpiece in any discussion of the 19th century British monarchy. Even her children who became monarchs or consorts abroad are often treated as extensions of her influence. In such a narrative, the individuality of each child is flattened, and those whose lives were less politically consequential are reduced to archetypes. The dutiful daughter, the tragic princess, the quiet supporter. Louise's story, with its blend of artistic ambition, social engagement, and carefully measured independence, resists such simplification. But resisting simplification often means resisting memorability in the popular imagination. The challenge, then, is to recognize the value of the quietly significant royal story. Louise's life may not have altered the course of nations, but it illuminates the lived experience of a woman navigating the constraints of both gender and royal status in the Victorian age. Her ability to assert herself as an artist, to advocate for education, and to connect meaningfully with communities in Canada speaks to a form of influence that is less about commanding history and more about shaping its texture. Such contributions are often the threads that hold together the grander narratives, even if they remain invisible when the tapestry is viewed from a distance. Preserving the legacies of figures like Louise also requires challenging the implicit hierarchy that places political impact above cultural and social influence. The arts, education, and philanthropy may not produce the decisive moments of political history, but they shape the societies in which that political history unfolds. By this measure, Louise's work as a sculptor and her support for cultural institutions contributed to the broader Victorian project of self-definition, just as much as the speeches of prime ministers or the proclamations of monarchs. To acknowledge this is to broaden our understanding of what kinds of achievements deserve historical attention. The prioritization of certain royal stories over others is as much about our own values as it is about the past. If we continue to measure significance primarily through political power and dynastic consequence, figures like Louise will always remain in the shadows. But if we expand our criteria to include the cultivation of culture, the advancement of education, and the quiet assertion of individuality against the currents of expectation, then her story takes on a new dimension. In doing so, we not only restore her to a more prominent place in history, but also enrich our understanding of the complexities of royal life beyond the throne. The movement to reintroduce Princess Louise into the broader public consciousness has gathered momentum slowly, almost imperceptibly at first, but it now carries the weight of several intersecting cultural trends that have transformed how we think about history, gender, and legacy. Her life, long overshadowed by her mother's formidable reign and the mythic aura surrounding the Victorian monarchy, has begun to re-emerge through the work of dedicated historians, curators, artists, and cultural institutions determined to tell a fuller, more nuanced story. This process of reclamation is neither quick nor simple. It requires both the piecing together of fragmented evidence and the reframing of what constitutes historical importance in the first place. Where once Louise might have been mentioned in passing as the sixth child or the sculptor princess, she is now starting to be recognized as a figure whose life offers insight into the complex intersections of gender, class, creativity, and imperial identity. One of the most visible fronts in this reclamation is the art world. Museums and heritage sites, once content to display Louise's sculptures without much commentary, have begun to foreground her authorship, placing her work in the context of her own creative journey rather than simply as a product of royal patronage. The statue of Queen Victoria at Kensington Palace, for example, is no longer simply presented as an anonymous or incidental piece of public art, but as the work of a daughter who possessed both the skill and the daring to master a discipline that, in her time, was considered beyond the reach of women of her rank. Exhibitions have increasingly included her alongside other women artists of the 19th century, creating dialogues that situate her work not as an oddity, but as part of a broader, often overlooked movement of female artistic production in an era of rigid gender roles. The renewed attention to her artistic career also invites deeper engagement with the ways in which she navigated the structural barriers facing women artists of her time. Louise's entry into professional sculpture was not merely a matter of indulging a hobby. It required challenging the prevailing belief that serious art, especially sculpture, with its physical demands, was the province of men. Her ability to secure commissions and produce work that entered public spaces was a testament not only to her technical ability, but to her persistence in pushing against these limitations. By placing her achievements within the broader struggle for women's access to artistic training and recognition, contemporary historians can frame her as a participant in and contributor to the slow dismantling of these barriers. Parallel to this artistic reevaluation is a growing recognition of her public service, both in Britain and in Canada. While earlier histories tended to gloss over her role as the vice-regal consort during her husband's term as Governor-General, recent scholarship has begun to explore how she used her position to engage with the communities around her. Her efforts to support cultural institutions, promote education, and connect with ordinary Canadians were notable in part because they went beyond the ceremonial duties expected of her. In an era when royal visits were often tightly controlled spectacles, Louise's willingness to move more freely among the public, to visit hospitals, attend exhibitions, and meet local artists, reflected a genuine interest in fostering cultural exchange. This aspect of her legacy has been easier to appreciate in Canada, where her name remains embedded in the landscape, from Lake Louise in Alberta to Louise Bridge in Calgary, and where her influence on the cultural fabric is more readily acknowledged. The challenge lies in connecting these localized memories to a broader narrative that crosses national boundaries. For too long, the British-centric telling of Victorian history has relegated Canada's role in Louise's life to a footnote, despite the fact that her years there represented one of the most independent and influential phases of her public career. Contemporary historians are now beginning to weave this Canadian chapter more fully into accounts of her life, not as an exotic interlude, but as a period that shaped her identity and expanded her understanding of her role as a royal woman. By integrating these experiences into the larger arc of her biography, they create a more complete portrait of a figure who moved between worlds, royal and common, British and colonial, artistic and political, with a fluidity that defied easy categorization. Reclaiming Louise's narrative also requires confronting the silences and omissions that have long defined her place in history. The destruction of her personal papers has often been cited as a reason for the gaps in our knowledge, but contemporary research is finding ways to work around this obstacle. By triangulating letters written to her, official records of her activities, press coverage of her public appearances, and the surviving artworks themselves, historians can reconstruct aspects of her personality, motivations, and influence. This methodology, while necessarily interpretive, allows for a richer, more textured understanding than the reductive forgotten princess label suggests. It is an approach that treats the absence of direct testimony not as an insurmountable void, but as an invitation to read the traces she left behind in new ways. Part of the reason this reclamation resonates so strongly today is that it aligns with a wider cultural movement toward questioning dominant historical narratives and recovering marginalized voices. The past several decades have seen a sustained effort to bring women's history, working-class history, and the histories of colonized peoples into the mainstream, challenging the traditional focus on great men, political leaders, and military events. In this context, Louise's story becomes more than a biographical curiosity. It becomes a case study in how structural biases, against women, against those outside direct political power, shape what we remember and what we forget. Her life demonstrates that even within the gilded sphere of royalty, invisibility was possible if one's contributions did not conform to the criteria of political drama or dynastic significance. This reframing inevitably invites the public to reflect on their own assumptions about historical importance. The question is not simply why Louise was forgotten, but why certain lives are remembered in the first place. If we understand history as a selective process, shaped by the interests of those who record it, then it becomes clear that reclaiming figures like Louise is not an act of nostalgic sentiment, but of historical correction. It is about expanding the scope of the narrative to include contributions that, while less visible in traditional political terms, were nonetheless formative in shaping cultural and social landscapes. In this sense, the contemporary effort to reclaim Louise's narrative is as much about the present as it is about the past. It reflects a desire to see in history a mirror for our own struggles to recognize and value diverse forms of achievement. Her life, which wove together artistry, public engagement, and a careful negotiation of personal autonomy within rigid structures, offers a model for how influence can be exercised outside conventional centers of power. This is a lesson with obvious relevance today, when the boundaries between political and cultural influence are increasingly porous, and when public service is recognized not only in legislative acts, but in acts of community building, cultural support, and advocacy. The tools for this reclamation are varied, ranging from academic research to popular media. Documentaries, historical novels, and even social media platforms have become vehicles for introducing Louise to audiences who might never pick up a specialized biography. These portrayals, while sometimes dramatized, serve the crucial function of making her visible again, of sparking the curiosity that leads people to seek out more authoritative accounts. The danger, of course, lies in oversimplification, but this is where the partnership between scholarly research and public storytelling becomes essential. By grounding popular representations in careful historical work, we can ensure that the reclaimed narrative remains both compelling and accurate. In recent years, there have also been efforts to physically preserve and interpret spaces connected to her life. Restorations of residences she inhabited, exhibitions of her artwork, and public talks about her role in Canadian history all contribute to anchoring her story in tangible, visit-able sites. Such efforts not only preserve the material culture associated with her, but also create opportunities for direct engagement, allowing visitors to see, quite literally, the spaces where she lived, worked, and influenced the world around her. This physical grounding is particularly important for countering the abstraction that often accompanies discussions of historical figures. It makes Louise real in a way that words alone cannot. Ultimately, the act of reclaiming her narrative is not simply about restoring her to the historical record, but about challenging the processes that led to her marginalization in the first place. It is a reminder that history is not a fixed and complete account, but a constantly evolving conversation in which new questions, perspectives, and priorities can bring overlooked stories to light. Louise's life, with its blend of creativity, service, and quiet defiance, invites us to broaden our understanding of what makes a life historically significant. It challenges us to value contributions that are not immediately measurable in political terms, but which, over time, shape the texture of societies and the possibilities available to those who come after. The more we engage with her story, the more we are forced to confront the selective nature of memory and the need to actively seek out the narratives that have been left behind. In doing so, we not only honor her achievements, but also practice the kind of historical attentiveness that ensures future generations will not have to reclaim the same stories all over again. Her life, once a faint outline in the shadow of a great monarch, now offers a clear and compelling case for why every life, no matter how far from the throne, deserves to be remembered in its full complexity. To draw together the threads of this journey into Princess Louise's life and the effort to reclaim her place in history is to return to a broader truth. The shaping of the past is rarely the work of only those who sit on thrones, command armies, or draft legislation. The making of history is a collective act, influenced by countless individuals whose contributions may not have been recorded with the fanfare afforded to political leaders or monarchs, yet whose presence altered the texture of their times in ways that still resonate. In focusing so intently on the towering figures, those whose names and images saturate textbooks, documentaries, and the public imagination, we risk missing the subtler currents that help explain how societies change, evolve, and remember themselves. Princess Louise's story exemplifies the quiet but enduring influence that a life lived with purpose, curiosity, and conviction can have. She did not seek to dominate the political sphere or command the public stage in the way her mother, Queen Victoria, inevitably did. Her impact was diffused, woven into her art, her public service, her advocacy for education and women's rights, and her genuine connection with communities at home and abroad. That diffusion has made her harder to pinpoint in the grand narrative, but it has also made her a compelling figure to revisit, for in doing so we learn to recognize the traces of other such lives that history has rendered faint. This work of recognition is not only about fairness to the individual, it is about enriching our understanding of the period itself. Without Louise's example, the Victorian era can too easily become a rigid tableau dominated by industrial progress, imperial expansion, and the unyielding image of the queen who lent her name to it. Including her reminds us that the era also contained people who pushed at its boundaries, sometimes gently, sometimes insistently, challenging expectations about what women could do, what royalty could mean, and what art could express. She stands as a link between the formal court and the restless cultural currents beyond its walls, between the prescribed duties of her station and the self-directed pursuits that gave her life texture and meaning. The process of reclaiming her from obscurity is therefore also an exercise in sharpening our historical sight. It asks us to notice the ways in which the canon of important figures is constructed, to question why certain achievements are elevated while others are dismissed or ignored. Louise was not alone in this marginalization. History's attic is crowded with royals whose stories are barely told, not because they lacked influence, but because their influence did not take the familiar forms of conquest, scandal, or succession. Some lived in the penumbra of more famous relatives, their lives judged unremarkable by comparison. Others were deliberately sidelined, their independence or unconventional choices seen as inconvenient to the prevailing narrative of royal decorum. By engaging with her life, we inevitably become more attuned to these silences. We begin to see the outlines of other forgotten or half-forgotten royals, siblings, cousins, and in-laws whose names might appear only in genealogical charts or brief asides in biographies of more prominent figures. They might have been patrons of local industries, founders of charitable institutions, advocates for social reform, or simply cultural bridges between the court and the wider world. Their stories, if uncovered, would almost certainly complicate and enrich the histories we think we know. This is not to romanticize the institution of monarchy or to pretend that all such figures were noble in purpose or admirable in character. Rather, it is to acknowledge that they lived in the same human complexity as anyone else, and that by recovering their narratives, we gain a fuller sense of how historical change happens, not solely through grand declarations and decisive battles, but also through small acts of persistence, quiet advocacy, artistic creation, and the patient building of connections. Louise's example offers a kind of methodological lesson, that to find such figures, one must often read against the grain, looking in the margins of official correspondence, the asides in newspapers, the overlooked signatures on works of art. One must ask not only who ruled, but who influenced, who inspired, who connected. These questions inevitably lead us toward lives that do not fit the standard heroic arc, but that nonetheless left discernible marks on their time. In urging a deeper appreciation for these less celebrated figures, there is also a challenge to the way we commemorate the past in public spaces. Statues, street names, memorials, and anniversaries tend to favor the already famous, reinforcing their dominance in our collective memory. Yet a more inclusive commemorative culture, one that acknowledges the breadth of contributors to a nation's history, can serve as a counterbalance. Imagine public recognition not only for the monarchs and ministers, but for those who quietly altered cultural expectations, who expanded access to education, who brought art into public life, or who bridged distant communities. Princess Louise's artistic legacy and her engagement with Canada offer precisely such opportunities for recognition, and the fact that she is now being rediscovered suggests that this broader commemorative approach is possible. At the same time, her story reminds us that historical recovery is an ongoing process. The past does not reveal itself in a single sweep of discovery. It comes into view through repeated acts of attention, research, and storytelling. Today's reclaimed narrative can easily become tomorrow's neglected one if interest fades, or if the structures that support historical inquiry, archives, museums, education, are weakened. To sustain this deeper appreciation, we must cultivate a habit of curiosity that extends beyond the famous names, a readiness to follow the faint traces that lead to fuller portraits. The encouragement is both simple and profound, to keep looking beyond the spotlight. Every era has its luminaries, but it also has its hidden constellations, and understanding the interplay between them is essential to grasping the complexity of the past. Princess Louise now shines a little more brightly in our historical awareness because people chose to look for her, to assemble the fragments of her life, to place her in conversation with the events and movements of her time. The same choice awaits us with countless others, royal and otherwise, who have been left in the shadows. By valuing these lives, we do more than honor the individuals themselves. We reshape the very narrative of history into something more representative of the many forms that influence can take. We learn that the grandeur of the past is not built solely on the deeds of the few who dominate the headlines of their day, but also on the quieter, steadier contributions of those who, like Louise, lived between the margins and the center, refusing to be entirely defined by either. It is in this spirit that the conclusion of her story becomes an opening into others. Somewhere in the historical record, there are more royals who traveled far from the seat of power and made a difference in local communities. More who turned to the arts or sciences rather than politics. More who, though never destined for the throne, nonetheless helped to shape the culture and values of their generation. Their recovery will not happen by accident. It will require the same deliberate curiosity, the same willingness to question the hierarchy of importance that kept Louise's name in the background for so long. To read history not only for its central characters, but for its supporting cast, for in their lives we often find the most revealing truths about an age. Louise's story, reclaimed from obscurity, proves that such a search is not only possible but deeply rewarding. It asks us to keep our eyes open for the next forgotten figure waiting to be brought back into the light, and to recognize, when we find them, that we are not merely recovering a person, but expanding the story of us all.